In the quiet courtroom, the air was thick with anticipation as the white judge sat at the elevated bench scanning through the papers before him. His stern face betrayed no emotion as he prepared to hear the next case. The room was filled with the hum of whispers and shuffling feet. As people took their seats, the heavy oak doors creaked shut, and all eyes were on the defendant, a black woman standing tall with a calm demeanor before the judge. Her name was Jasmine Williams, and she was no stranger to this small-town courtroom, though today she was not in her usual role of peacemaker, but standing accused of causing a public disturbance at a community event. Her reputation in the town was well known. For years, Jasmine had acted as a trusted mediator, settling disputes among families, neighbors, and even businesses, but today she stood before the judge, who seemed to have already made up his mind about her. The judge was a middle-aged man named Thomas Bishop, a figure respected in the courthouse for his strict adherence to the law. His approach was often unyielding and his rulings swift. Jasmine had always been aware of the power dynamics that shaped this small town, and though she had earned the trust of many, the judge was not one of them. She had heard whispers of his tendency to favor those who adhered to societal norms and rules, while dismissing the actions of those who strayed from them. As the prosecutor began speaking, his voice was filled with conviction as he described how Jasmine had been involved in a confrontation at the community event. He spoke of loud arguments and heated exchanges of words, painting Jasmine as a disruptive force who had instigated chaos where there had been none. He claimed that her interference in what was supposed to be a peaceful gathering had led to an escalating conflict between two long-standing community families. He seemed to paint her as the villain of a story that she knew all too well. Jasmine stood in silence as the prosecutor spoke, her expression unreadable. She had learned long ago that in situations like these it was best to stay composed and not give away too much. Her eyes remained fixed on the judge as she waited for the prosecutor to finish his accusations. She could feel the weight of the room bearing down on her, the weight of history and assumptions that came with being a black woman in a predominantly white town where the lines of power were rarely crossed. When it was her turn to speak, Jasmine addressed the judge, her voice steady and calm, but the words she spoke were a stark contrast to the image that had been painted of her. She spoke not of chaos, but of peace. She described how she had been called to the event to mediate between two families who had been in conflict for years. The situation had been tense, but she had been doing what she always did, trying to keep the peace, trying to prevent an argument from turning into something more dangerous. Jasmine explained that she had not been the instigator of the conflict, but had been attempting to diffuse a situation that had already gotten out of hand. The judge listened intently. Though his face gave nothing away, he made no sign that he was considering her words. Instead, he seemed to scrutinize her every move and gesture. Jasmine knew she was not just being judged for her actions in that moment, she was being judged for who she was and for what she represented, a black woman in a predominantly white community, a woman who had taken it upon herself to solve problems that others were unwilling to touch. She understood the unspoken rules of power that governed the town, and she knew that in the eyes of many her actions would always be viewed with suspicion. The judge sat silently as Jasmine finished her explanation. He seemed to consider her words for a moment before glancing down at the papers in front of him. The room was still. The only sound was the occasional shuffle of feet or a cough from the back of the room. Jasmine stood firm, her eyes never leaving his face. She had said everything she needed to say. Now it was in the hands of the judge, but she could already sense how this would go. His mind was already made up, or so it seemed. She could feel the subtle undercurrent of doubt in the air as he looked at her, not as a mediator or a trusted community member, but as someone who had disrupted the order of things. The prosecutor, who had been watching the exchange with growing satisfaction, now spoke again. His tone was sharp and filled with authority. He questioned Jasmine's role at the event, implying that as an outsider her involvement was inappropriate and unwelcome. He continued to argue that her actions had been reckless and had made the situation far worse than it needed to be. His words felt heavy in the room as they echoed against the walls. His accusations seemed to confirm the assumptions people had about her, that she was a troublemaker, someone who couldn't stay out of things that didn't concern her. But Jasmine remained silent. She wasn't here to argue. She had explained herself, and now it was up to the judge to decide. Judge Bishop did not immediately respond. Instead, he looked at the prosecutor, then back at Jasmine, as if weighing the severity of the situation. His eyes narrowed as he considered her, standing there in front of him, a woman who had earned respect from many in the town, yet here, she was accused of causing a scene. Something about the situation felt off to him, but the courtroom had rules and procedures, and those rules had to be followed without question. There was no place for feelings or second guesses, not in his court, at least not now. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady and firm, though there was a hint of uncertainty beneath the surface. He announced that Jasmine would be fined for disturbing the peace. The fine was steep but not extraordinary for such a charge. It was a punishment that fit the crime in his eyes, or so he thought. The gavel came down with a resounding thud as he concluded the case and dismissed the courtroom. Jasmine's shoulders straightened, but there was no sign of protest from her. She simply nodded, acknowledging the ruling, and turned to leave the courtroom. As she walked out, she could feel the eyes of the room on her. Every step was measured, every movement scrutinized. She felt the weight of the judgment, and yet she did not speak. She did not raise her voice in protest, because she knew that raising her voice would change nothing. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, the usual crowd of onlookers, some curious, others simply waiting for the next case to be heard. But there was a noticeable shift in the air. As Jasmine walked past them, her head held high. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Some were sympathetic, while others seemed to question her actions. Some were puzzled at the outcome of the case. They knew her as a woman who kept peace, not as someone who would ever intentionally cause harm. Jasmine's heart raced, but she remained composed. She had faced much worse in her life than a fine from a judge who didn't understand the truth. She knew that her reputation in the community had always been built on trust and respect that had been earned over many years, and she knew that this moment would not change that, not in the long run. In the days that followed the courtroom decision, a quiet tension spread through the town as word of the ruling circulated. Those who had witnessed the case in the courtroom whispered amongst themselves, some questioning the judge's decision, while others tried to make sense of what had happened. Jasmine was not one to dwell on what others thought, but she could feel the shift in the air, the subtle change in how people looked at her. The fine had been handed down, and now it was time to move forward. But as the days passed, something unexpected happened. The murmurs of discontent began to grow louder as more and more people spoke out in Jasmine's defense. At first, it was small conversations in coffee shops and on street corners. A few locals who had seen Jasmine mediate a difficult family dispute or step in to prevent a fight from escalating shared their stories with others. Slowly, the whispers turned into more organized discussions about Jasmine's role in the community, how she had been a quiet force for peace, how her reputation as a mediator had kept the town from falling into chaos. More than once, people began to see the incident in the courtroom from a different perspective. No longer was Jasmine the woman accused of causing trouble, but the woman who had always worked tirelessly to prevent it. One afternoon, Judge Bishop was walking through the town square when he overheard a conversation between two women. They were talking about the recent case and how they had always respected Jasmine for her ability to bring people together. They spoke of a time when Jasmine had mediated a dispute between two rival families over property lines, preventing a violent confrontation from breaking out, and another time when she had helped settle a bitter disagreement between a local business owner and a customer, avoiding a lengthy and costly court battle. The more the women spoke, the more Judge Bishop's curiosity grew. He had heard bits and pieces of these stories before, but hearing them firsthand from those who had experienced it made him pause. Later that day, he found himself in his office, staring out of the window, his thoughts consumed by the woman he had just sentenced to a fine, a woman who had been praised by the very people he respected most. He thought back to the courtroom, how he had looked at her that day and passed judgment so quickly, how he had assumed that her involvement in the event had been disruptive, how he had failed to see the bigger picture. He had seen only a moment of conflict without understanding the larger context in which it had occurred. It was then that the seeds of doubt began to sprout in his mind. Maybe he had been wrong about her. Maybe he had let his own biases cloud his judgment. The more he thought about it, the more uncomfortable he became. He had always prided himself on being fair, on making decisions based on facts and evidence, but now he wondered if he had allowed his assumptions about Jasmine to influence his decision. He thought about the times when he had seen her in town, quietly settling disputes without ever drawing attention to herself. She had always been a calming presence, someone people trusted, but in the courtroom she had been something else in his eyes. She had been an outsider, someone who had caused disruption, yet here he was questioning his own assumptions. Determined to get to the bottom of it, he began asking around, quietly speaking to people who knew Jasmine better than he did. He spoke to the town's sheriff, who had seen Jasmine step in during tense situations and calm down agitated individuals without raising her voice. He spoke to the local librarian, who recalled a time when Jasmine had mediated a dispute between two volunteers who had disagreed over a project. She had not only resolved their issues, but had helped them become friends again. The more he heard, the more he realized that Jasmine's role in the community went far beyond what he had initially thought. It was then that the judge began to wonder if he had done more harm than good by issuing that fine. Had he unfairly penalized a woman who had been a constant source of stability for the town? Had he underestimated her ability to bring people together without ever needing to raise a hand or shout a word? Judge Bishop's mind raced as he reflected on the stories he had heard in the days following his ruling. Each story painted a picture of a woman who was nothing like the disruptive force he had believed her to be. His discomfort grew with each new detail he learned about Jasmine Williams. The more he understood how deeply embedded she was in the fabric of the town. She had been the one people turned to when conflict arose, when tempers flared and disputes threatened to escalate into violence. She had been the one to quietly step in and resolve the issues with a calm demeanor and a sharp mind. He could no longer ignore the mounting sense that he had made a mistake in his judgment. As the judge walked through the courthouse halls, the weight of his decision followed him. It was a burden he wasn't used to carrying. His decisions were usually clear-cut based on the law and the facts presented before him, but this case was different this time. The lines weren't so easily drawn, and the facts weren't as straightforward as they appeared. He had only heard one side of the story, the prosecutor's account of the events, and had failed to consider the full picture. Jasmine's side had been ignored or dismissed without a second thought. The more the judge thought about it, the more he realized how his decision had been influenced by his own assumptions about Jasmine based on her race and gender. He had seen her as an outsider, someone who didn't belong in the circle of those who were allowed to mediate conflicts with authority and respect. Yet it was clear now that she had earned that respect long before he had ever crossed paths with her. It wasn't just the stories he had heard that made him question his ruling. It was the realization that he had judged her not on the merit of her actions, but on a set of preconceived notions that had nothing to do with the situation at hand. A few days later, as he sat in his office reviewing his cases, Judge Bishop found himself unable to focus. The discomfort gnawed at him. He could no longer shake the feeling that he had wronged Jasmine Williams, and that perhaps the fine he had imposed was not just a mistake, but a deeply unjust punishment. He knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. He needed to do something to make things right. With a sense of resolve building within him, Judge Bishop made a decision. He would seek out Jasmine and apologize to her. He knew it wouldn't be easy. He knew that a simple apology wouldn't erase the harm he had done, but it was a start. It was the first step toward acknowledging the mistake he had made and trying to make amends. He had to meet with her in person and express his regret for his hasty decision to judge her without truly understanding the role she played in the town and the lives of its people. The judge spent the rest of the day trying to arrange a meeting with Jasmine. He was unsure how she would respond, or if she would even agree to meet with him. He knew he had to try. He could not continue to carry the weight of this mistake without attempting to fix it. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how deeply her role as a mediator had impacted the town, how much peace she had brought without anyone ever noticing until now. The next morning, Judge Bishop stood in front of his mirror, unsure of what to say to Jasmine. He had practiced his words over and over in his mind, but each time they felt insufficient. How could he possibly convey the gravity of his mistake? He had wronged her, he had misjudged her, and now he needed to find a way to repair the damage he had done. He made the decision to go to her personally. He knew it was the only way to make things right. He couldn't hide behind a letter or a formal apology. This required more than that. This required a confrontation of his own mistakes and biases. He'd arranged for the meeting through mutual acquaintances and waited anxiously for the day to arrive when he would come face to face with the woman whose reputation he had tarnished. Though he had heard the stories and the praise from the community, he still felt unsure of how Jasmine would react to his apology. He had seen her calm resolve in the courtroom, but he wasn't sure if that calmness would extend to a man who had imposed a fine on her without understanding her true role in the community. When the day finally came, he arrived at the small community center where she was known to hold her mediation sessions. He took a deep breath before stepping through the door. Inside the room, Jasmine was already there, sitting at a table with a calm expression, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She was dressed simply yet with a quiet dignity that commanded respect. The moment she saw the judge enter, her face remained neutral, but there was a slight shift in her posture. She knew why he was here, and for a brief moment neither of them spoke. They simply stood there in the room, caught in an unspoken understanding that this conversation could not be avoided anymore. After a long pause, Judge Bishop finally spoke, his voice hesitant yet sincere. He began by acknowledging the mistake he had made in the courtroom and how deeply he regretted his decision. He told her how he had heard from so many people in the town about her role as a mediator, how they had praised her ability to diffuse even the most volatile situations with grace and wisdom. He admitted that he had allowed his assumptions and his rigid sense of authority to cloud his judgment that day in the courtroom, and that he had failed to truly see who she was and what she stood for. Jasmine listened quietly, her expression unreadable. She didn't interrupt him or rush to respond. She simply let him speak as he poured out his apology. When he finished, there was another long silence in the room, and for a moment it felt as if time itself had paused as Jasmine absorbed his words. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke, her voice soft yet firm. She told him that she appreciated his apology, but that it was not just his words that mattered, it was his actions. She said that apologies without change were hollow, and that true understanding required more than just regret, it required growth. She explained that her work in the community was not about gaining recognition, but about fostering peace and understanding where there had been conflict, and that she had done it without ever seeking validation from those who held power. The judge felt a pang of realization as her words sunk in. She wasn't just forgiving him for his mistake, she was challenging him to see beyond the surface, to look deeper, and understand the true value of the work she did in the town. She reminded him that judgment could be a powerful tool, but it was only meaningful when wielded with true understanding and empathy. It was then that the judge fully realized how much he still had to learn and how much he had taken for granted in his position of authority. Judge Bishop left the meeting with a heavy heart. His steps felt slower than usual as he walked down the quiet street outside the community center. The words Jasmine had spoken lingered in his mind like a quiet echo. Her challenge had struck a chord deep within him, and he found himself reflecting on the truth of what she had said. He had apologized, but in that moment he realized that apology was only the first step. There was so much more he needed to understand, and so much more he needed to change about how he viewed not only Jasmine but the very nature of justice itself. The days that followed were filled with a quiet unease. He couldn't shake the sense that he had missed something profound about the role he played as a judge, and about the people who came before him. He had always believed in the law above all else, that the law was an absolute guide to fairness and order. But Jasmine's words had made him question whether the law alone could ever truly capture the complexity of human relationships and the delicate balance of power in his community. It was a humbling realization, and one that he could not ignore. He began to observe the people around him more closely. He paid attention to the small interactions, the subtle exchanges between neighbors, the quiet ways in which people communicated their needs and desires without ever speaking a word. The more he looked, the more he saw the undercurrents of tension that ran through the town, not just between families but between races and classes. He began to notice how often misunderstandings were at the root of these conflicts, how quickly situations could spiral out of control when people felt unheard or unseen. With each passing day, Judge Bishop found himself more aware of the limitations of his own perspective, the limitations of the law that had always been his guiding principle. He started to ask himself how many other times he had made judgments based on incomplete understanding, how many other people had come before him and left the courtroom feeling misunderstood or unfairly treated. It was a bitter thought, but one that he could not ignore. He began to realize how much of his authority had been built on assumptions and biases that had nothing to do with the truth of the situations before him. As he continued to reflect on these questions, he found himself thinking more and more about the people who had spoken out in defense of Jasmine after her ruling, about the families and neighbors who had trusted her to mediate their disputes without ever needing to involve the law. He wondered how many of those people had been quietly watching his actions all along, waiting for a moment when he would show them that he understood the true meaning of justice. Jasmine had been doing this work without fanfare, without seeking accolades, but she had been making a real difference in the lives of people around her. He now saw how valuable that was in ways he hadn't before. Determined to make amends, he sought out Jasmine once again, this time with a different purpose. He wanted to learn from her. He wanted to understand how she had managed to bridge the divides between people when he himself had often struggled to see beyond the surface of a case. He reached out to her through mutual acquaintances and asked if she would be willing to meet again, this time not as a judge to a defendant, but as a student seeking guidance from someone who had long understood the complexities of human connection. Jasmine agreed to meet him once more, and when they sat down together again, it was under very different circumstances. There were no courtrooms, no formalities, no accusations or defenses, only two people sharing a moment of honest conversation. She welcomed him with the same calm demeanor she always had, but there was something different in the way they spoke to each other now, an unspoken understanding that they both had a lot to learn from one another. He asked her about her work as a mediator, about how she had learned to navigate the delicate balance of power and empathy, how she knew when to step in and when to stay back. Jasmine spoke with patience and clarity, explaining the core principles of her approach to conflict resolution, the importance of listening deeply to both sides, the value of creating a space where people felt safe enough to speak their truths, and the need to foster mutual respect even in the most difficult of situations. As he listened to her words, Judge Bishop felt a deep sense of gratitude. He realized that he had much to learn, and that true justice was not just about following the law, it was about understanding the people who came before him and seeing them not as cases, but as individuals with their own stories and struggles. He knew that this was only the beginning of his journey toward becoming a more compassionate and thoughtful judge, someone who could balance the law with empathy and understanding, someone who could recognize the power of mediation and peacekeeping in ways he had never before considered. Judge Bishop left their meeting with a renewed sense of purpose. As he walked back through the quiet streets, his mind buzzed with the lessons he had learned from Jasmine. Her words resonated within him more than he had expected, and as he reflected on their conversation, he felt an overwhelming desire to change, to become the kind of judge who could see beyond the rules and the rigid structure of the courtroom, to truly understand the people who stood before him. He had come to realize that there was far more to justice than the application of the law. It was about understanding context, it was about recognizing the nuances of each individual situation, and it was about seeing people for who they really were, not just what they appeared to be on paper. In the days that followed, Judge Bishop began to change how he approached his cases. He still followed the law, but now he approached each case with more humility and a deeper sense of empathy. When someone walked into his courtroom, he no longer saw just a name and a charge. He saw a person with a story, a person with struggles and triumphs that he could never fully understand, but a person deserving of respect and fairness. He began to ask more questions, to dig deeper into the circumstances surrounding each case, to learn not only about the actions of the person before him, but about the conditions that led them to that point. Jasmine had given him a new lens through which to view the world around him, and he began to realize that the power of mediation and reconciliation went far beyond the courtroom. He had seen the way she had worked with people to create solutions that didn't involve punishment or conflict, but rather understanding and cooperation. It made him think of the many cases he had ruled on in the past, where perhaps a different approach could have yielded better results. Instead of handing down fines or sentences, he could have sought other ways to resolve the issues. He wondered how many times he had failed to see the opportunity for healing and understanding in the midst of conflict. It wasn't long before the community began to notice the shift in Judge Bishop's demeanor. The town had always respected him, but now they saw a different side of him, a side that wasn't so quick to judge, a side that took the time to listen and to understand before making a decision. People began to speak of his fairness in a new light. They spoke of how he had become more approachable, more willing to consider the full context of a case, and more willing to find solutions that didn't involve strict legal consequences, but rather focused on healing and reconciliation. The respect he had earned from the community grew even more as he became known not just as a judge who upheld the law, but as one who sought to bring people together. Jasmine continued to serve as a mediator in the community, and though she had never sought recognition for her work, she began to notice a shift in how people approached her. They came to her with more trust, more openness, because they knew that she understood the complexities of human conflict and that she could help them find common ground where there seemed to be none. She had always been a quiet force in the town, but now her influence began to spread even further as more people saw the value in the work she did and sought her guidance in resolving their disputes. Despite the changes in the town, Judge Bishop knew that his journey was far from over. He had learned much, but he also knew there was still so much to learn. He continued to seek out Jasmine's advice and guidance, often asking her for insight on how to handle difficult cases where the law alone couldn't provide a clear answer. He became more involved in the community outside of the courtroom, attending town meetings and participating in local events where he could learn more about the lives of the people he served. He began to see his role as a judge not just as one of authority, but as one of service and understanding. It was a long and sometimes difficult journey, but Judge Bishop knew that the changes he was making would have a lasting impact, not just on his career, but on the entire community. He had always believed in the importance of justice, but now he understood that justice was not just about punishment or retribution. It was about understanding the people behind the cases and finding ways to restore peace and balance in their lives. As time passed, Judge Bishop's transformation became even more noticeable. His approach to each case became more thoughtful and measured. He no longer made snap judgments or relied solely on legal precedent. He began to approach the courtroom with a renewed sense of humility, recognizing that every person who stood before him carried their own burdens, their own stories, and that justice was not always about following a strict set of rules. Sometimes it was about recognizing the human aspect of a situation and taking that into account when making a decision. He had learned from Jasmine that conflict resolution didn't always have to come from a place of authority or power. Sometimes it came from understanding, listening, and finding common ground. Word began to spread about the changes Judge Bishop had made in his approach to the law, and how he had begun to work more closely with the community. He wasn't just seen as a figurehead anymore, but as someone who truly cared about the well-being of the people he served. Local leaders began to take notice of his efforts, and even sought him out for advice on how to address ongoing issues in the town. He had become a trusted voice in the community, someone whose opinion mattered, not just because of his position, but because of the integrity and compassion he had shown in his work. One day during a town meeting, the mayor called on Judge Bishop to speak about the importance of community mediation and conflict resolution. The room was full of local leaders and residents who were eager to hear his thoughts on the subject. Judge Bishop took a deep breath as he stood up and walked to the front of the room. He looked out over the crowd and felt a sense of gratitude for the journey he had been on and for the lessons he had learned from Jasmine. He spoke about how his views on justice had evolved over the past year, and how his understanding of what it truly meant to serve the people had deepened. He acknowledged how he had once viewed the law as a rigid structure that had little room for flexibility or empathy, but how through his interactions with the community and with Jasmine, he had come to realize that justice was not just about punishment, it was about restoration and healing. He spoke about the importance of mediation as a tool for resolving conflicts without the need for legal intervention, and how it had proven to be a more effective way of helping people find solutions that worked for everyone involved. His words resonated with the crowd as they listened attentively. He could see the respect in their eyes as they recognized the growth he had undergone and the genuine care he had for their town. They had seen the changes in him over the past months, and now they understood why he had made those changes. It was not because he was trying to gain approval or accolades, but because he had come to realize that true justice was not about following the law to the letter. It was about creating an environment where people felt heard, understood, and respected. After the meeting, several residents approached him to thank him for his words and for the changes he had made. They spoke about how much they appreciated his willingness to listen and to find solutions that didn't just rely on legal authority, but on human connection and empathy. They told him that the town had become a better place because of the work he had done, and that they were proud to have him as their judge. Judge Bishop felt a deep sense of fulfillment as he left the meeting. He had spent so many years focused on the letter of the law that he had forgotten the most important part of his job was to serve the people and to understand them as individuals. He had learned from Jasmine that true justice was not just about rules and regulations. It was about creating a space where people could come together to find common ground and where healing could take place in a way that was meaningful to everyone involved. As he walked back to his office, he thought about the journey he had taken, how he had gone from a man who made snap judgments based solely on the law to someone who now understood the value of listening and the importance of empathy in all aspects of life. He knew there was still much work to be done, but for the first time in a long while he felt that he was on the right path and that the changes he had made would continue to ripple through the community for years to come. The weeks following the town meeting were filled with a sense of purpose for Judge Bishop. He felt like he had finally found a deeper meaning to his role as a judge. No longer was it about wielding authority in a cold and detached way, but about being an active participant in the community and understanding the true needs of the people he served. He became more involved in local programs that focused on conflict resolution and mediation, reaching out to local organizations to offer his support and expertise. He began attending workshops alongside community leaders, where they discussed new methods of fostering communication and healing in the town. He worked alongside Jasmine on several initiatives to bring different groups together who had long been divided by misunderstanding and distrust. It was during these collaborations that Judge Bishop saw firsthand the impact of the work Jasmine had done over the years. He had always known she was a respected mediator, but now he could see the depth of her influence, the way people looked up to her and trusted her judgment. When issues arose, they came to her with the belief that she could offer real solutions to their problems, and he began to see why she was so beloved in the town, not because she held a title or had any official recognition, but because she had consistently shown up for people with empathy and a genuine desire to help. He also began to understand how much mediation could prevent further legal issues down the line. Jasmine had taught him that true conflict resolution wasn't just about finding solutions to the immediate problem, but about creating an environment where people felt comfortable and safe enough to work through their differences without escalating to more destructive behaviors. It wasn't about punishment, it was about creating lasting change and fostering understanding between people who might have otherwise remained divided. One particular instance stood out to him. There had been a long-standing dispute between two families in the town over property boundaries, a feud that had spanned generations and caused considerable tension in the community for years. The families had tried everything from legal battles to threats, but nothing had ever resolved the underlying conflict. It was Jasmine who stepped in, offering to mediate the dispute. She sat down with both families together and patiently listened to their grievances without judgment for hours. She created an environment where both sides could express their feelings freely and without fear of retaliation. After several sessions, she helped the families come to a mutual understanding about their shared history and their common interests. The conflict was resolved not through legal action, but through communication, trust, and compromise. Witnessing this process firsthand helped Judge Bishop realize the power of mediation in a way he had never considered before. He had always believed that the legal system was the ultimate authority on resolving disputes, but now he understood that true justice didn't always come from a courtroom or a ruling. It came from the willingness of people to listen to each other and to work toward a solution that benefited everyone involved. It also made him reflect on the many cases he had ruled on in the past where he had imposed legal decisions without considering the human aspect of the situation. Without fully understanding the complexities of the individuals involved, he began to question how many times his decisions had perpetuated conflict, rather than resolving it. How many times his rulings had been influenced by his own biases and assumptions without him even realizing it. He now understood that the law was not infallible, and that his role as a judge was to balance the law with compassion and understanding. He was becoming more involved in the community than ever before, and his relationships with those around him grew stronger. As a result, he found that people began to approach him not with fear or reluctance, but with respect and trust. They saw him as someone who understood the importance of fairness and empathy, someone who wasn't just a figure of authority, but a person who truly cared about the well-being of the town and its people. Judge Bishop also saw how his own personal growth was reflected in the changes he saw in the town. People were beginning to engage with one another more openly, and honestly, they were more willing to listen and to find common ground, and it was clear that the work he had done alongside Jasmine was having a lasting impact. He had seen the power of mediation and communication firsthand, and he knew that it was something that needed to be woven into the fabric of the town's future. It was no longer just about making judgments. It was about fostering peace and understanding in a way that could break down barriers and build lasting connections. As Judge Bishop continued his journey of growth and understanding, he began to realize how much his work had changed the town itself. The ripple effects of his efforts to implement mediation and empathy into his rulings were beginning to spread far beyond his courtroom. It was in the schools, where students began to resolve conflicts with the tools they had learned from his initiatives. It was in the local businesses, where people no longer saw one another as competitors, but as partners. It was in the homes where families began to communicate more openly and resolve their issues with less anger and more understanding. Judge Bishop's relationship with Jasmine continued to grow stronger as well. Their shared vision of creating a more harmonious community had become the foundation of their work together, and they continued to collaborate on various projects throughout the town. He began to lean on her wisdom more often, and she in turn offered him support when he was faced with difficult decisions. There was an unspoken bond between them built on mutual respect and trust, and he knew that without her guidance he wouldn't have come this far. She had shown him that the law wasn't the only way to achieve justice. It was through understanding people's hearts and minds that true change could occur. One evening, after another successful mediation session with a local family, Judge Bishop found himself walking with Jasmine back to the community center. The sky was painted with the colors of the setting sun, and there was a peaceful quiet in the air. As they walked side by side, they spoke about the progress the town had made and how much further they still had to go. They reflected on how many people had come to them for help in the past year, and how the town itself had started to heal from years of division. As they reached the front doors of the community center, Jasmine turned to him with a smile. She thanked him for his dedication and his willingness to embrace change. She told him that she had never imagined that a judge could become such an integral part of the community, but that through his actions he had shown that it was possible to blend the law with compassion and understanding. Judge Bishop felt a warmth spread through him at her words, and for the first time in a long while he realized just how much he had grown as a person. He had started this journey thinking that he was simply a judge trying to correct a mistake, but now he saw that he had become part of something much bigger, something that had the potential to change lives and bring people together in ways he had never thought possible. The next morning he stood in his office looking out the window at the town he had spent so many years serving. He realized that his work was far from done, but that the work he had already done was meaningful. He wasn't just serving the law anymore, he was serving the people. He was creating a community built on empathy and understanding, and he knew that this was just the beginning. The changes they had made together were only the first step, but they had planted the seeds for something greater, something that could flourish and grow over time. Judge Bishop thought about the future and the possibilities that lay ahead. There were still challenges to face and conflicts to resolve, but he no longer feared them. He had learned that true justice wasn't just about making decisions in a courtroom, it was about fostering connections and promoting understanding between people who had been divided by circumstances beyond their control. He had learned that it wasn't about being right or being in control. It was about working together to find solutions that worked for everyone involved. With this realization, he walked out of his office and back into the town he had come to love. He knew that there would be more difficult days ahead, but he felt ready to face them with the lessons he had learned and the strength of the community that stood beside him. He had transformed from a man who wielded the law with unquestioning authority to one who understood the power of empathy and collaboration, and in doing so he had become not just a better judge, but a better person. As months passed, Judge Bishop became more deeply embedded in the community. His connection with the people of the town grew stronger with each passing day. He had learned to see beyond the surface and understand the complexities that shaped each individual. He had stopped viewing people as cases to be judged and had begun to see them as stories waiting to be understood. Each person who came before him in the courtroom was a reflection of the life they had lived and the challenges they had faced, and Judge Bishop was no longer focused solely on punishment but on restoration and understanding. His approach to justice had inspired others in the town to follow suit. Local leaders began to take his lead by adopting more empathetic approaches to community issues. They worked together to create initiatives that focused on healing and reconciliation rather than just punishment. These programs encouraged open dialogue between different groups within the town, allowing people to discuss their grievances and find common ground. Where they once saw only division, they had started to create a network of understanding that stretched across the town and was slowly beginning to change the culture itself. It was a Thursday afternoon when Judge Bishop received a call from the mayor, who wanted to meet with him at the town hall. The mayor was eager to speak with him about a new project they had been considering, a community-wide restorative justice program modeled after the success of the mediation efforts that Judge Bishop and Jasmine had spearheaded together. They wanted to take the lessons they had learned and apply them to a larger scale, involving schools, local businesses, and even the police department. It was an ambitious idea, one that would take time and effort, but one that had the potential to change the town forever. As Judge Bishop listened to the mayor's proposal, he felt a surge of excitement and apprehension. The idea was bold and had the potential to make a lasting impact on the community, but it also carried a great deal of risk. What if the town wasn't ready for such a change? What if the old ways of doing things were too ingrained in the culture for this new approach to take root? But as he thought about it more, he realized that this was the natural next step for the work they had started. He had already seen how the principles of empathy and communication had transformed the town, and he believed that with the right support and education, this restorative justice program could bring even more healing to the community. It was time to take the next step in their journey together, to create a town that valued peace over punishment and collaboration over division. Judge Bishop agreed to the mayor's proposal, and they began to work together to develop the framework for the restorative justice program. It would involve training for community leaders, teachers, law enforcement officials, and residents on how to facilitate restorative circles and conflict resolution sessions. The goal was to create a system where people could come together to address harm and seek repair without relying on punitive measures. They would focus on building relationships and promoting accountability through understanding and dialogue rather than through punishment and fear. Over the next several months, the town saw a shift in its culture. The program slowly gained traction as more and more people became involved. Judge Bishop worked closely with Jasmine and other community leaders to ensure that everyone felt supported in the process. They held workshops and informational sessions to educate the town on how restorative justice worked and how it could benefit the community as a whole. People began to realize that they didn't need to turn to the courts or the police to resolve their issues. They could work together to find solutions on their own. It wasn't always easy, and there were still challenges along the way, but the progress was undeniable. As Judge Bishop walked through the town one evening reflecting on the changes he had witnessed, He felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey he had been on. He had never imagined that his role as a judge could evolve into something so much more than a position of authority. He had become a catalyst for change, a part of something bigger than himself, something that would outlast his time in office. He looked around at the people who were working together to build a better future for the town, and he knew that this was only the beginning. The work they had done would continue to inspire future generations to embrace empathy and understanding as the foundation for justice. He had come to realize that true justice wasn't just about following the law, it was about building a community where everyone could thrive and where understanding was the key to lasting peace. As Judge Bishop stood at the edge of the town square one crisp evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had seen the town transform in ways he never thought possible. The changes had not happened overnight, but they had been steady and undeniable. The efforts he had put in over the past months had begun to take root, and there was no turning back now. The streets that once buzzed with tension and division now hummed with a new energy. The community had found a way to heal and to move forward together, and Judge Bishop had played an instrumental role in that transformation. He remembered the days when he first arrived at the bench, how distant and detached he had been from the lives of the people who stood before him in his courtroom. He had believed that justice was simply about following the law, but he had learned so much since then. He had learned that justice was not about punishment or authority, it was about compassion and connection. It was about creating an environment where people felt heard and understood, where disputes could be resolved without tearing people apart, where reconciliation was the ultimate goal, not retribution. His mind wandered to Jasmine. She had been the catalyst for this change. Without her guidance, without her wisdom, he might never have seen the flaws in his approach to justice. She had shown him that there was more to the world than the rigid structure of the law, and that true peace came from empathy and understanding. Jasmine had always known this, but it had taken him time to catch up. She had never sought recognition for the work she did, but he knew that without her the town would not have made it this far together. They had built something that could last for generations, something that could serve as a model for other communities. Judge Bishop walked slowly through the square past familiar faces who greeted him with smiles and waves. There was a time when people avoided him. When they saw him walking down the street, they had feared him, they had feared his judgments, but now it was different. Now people came to him for advice, for help with their issues, for guidance in resolving disputes. They trusted him because they knew that he saw them not as cases or problems, but as people. They knew he would listen to their concerns and help them find solutions that worked for everyone. He had become not just a judge, but a mentor, a friend, a part of the community. The restorative justice program that he and the mayor had implemented was now flourishing. It had expanded beyond the town square into the schools, the businesses, the homes. The town had become a place where people worked together to resolve their differences through dialogue and understanding, where mediation was the first choice and legal action was the last resort. It had become a town where people felt empowered to speak up and to listen, where they knew that their voices would be heard and respected. As Judge Bishop continued his walk, he reflected on how far he had come, how far the town had come from a place of division to a place of healing. He thought about the countless hours spent working with the community, listening to their stories, facilitating difficult conversations. He thought about the moments of tension and frustration, but also the moments of breakthrough, the moments when people reached across divides and found common ground. Those were the moments that made all the hard work worth it. He stopped at the edge of the park, where a group of children were playing. They were laughing and running through the grass, their joy infectious. He smiled to himself. This was the future he had been working for, a future where these children would grow up in a community that valued empathy over judgment, that prioritized understanding over fear. They would inherit a town that had learned the power of listening and the importance of coming together to solve problems. For the first time in a long while, Judge Bishop felt a sense of peace. He knew that his work wasn't finished. There would always be challenges ahead, but he was no longer afraid of them. He had learned that the path to true justice wasn't through punishment or authority. It was through understanding, connection, and compassion. He had learned that a community built on these values could overcome anything, and as he stood there, watching the children play, he knew that the future of this town was bright. It was a future where everyone could find their place, and where justice would always be served with kindness.